You're listening to When Life Gives You Lemons, the podcast that speaks to high-performing individuals who have been through adversity but come back stronger. I'm your host, Emma Levy, a physiotherapist who has helped elite athletes on their way to Olympic success. This podcast was born following my own trauma. When I was diagnosed with breast cancer at the age of just 36, sat in the chemo chair, I set myself the goal of starting a podcast to explore resilience and the importance of mindset. Before I introduce today's guest, I just want to take a quick moment to thank you for listening. This is now season 6 of When Life Gives You Lemons, and I couldn't have kept it going without my listeners. If you enjoy listening, do please remember to press the follow button, which you can find on all the major listening platforms. Also, a reminder that you're able to watch all of our episodes on YouTube, and you can subscribe there as well to make sure you don't miss any of our new content. You can also follow us on Instagram at Life Lemons Podcast. Now on with this week's show. Today I'm welcoming Dr. Tommy Wood to the podcast. Tommy is a renowned professor of neuroscience, a researcher, and an athletic performance consultant. He has an undergraduate degree in biochemistry from Cambridge University and a medical degree from Oxford University, and then a PhD in physiology and neuroscience from Oslo. So on paper, Tommy is a very clever man. I have heard him on other podcasts and was very keen to talk to him to get his take on health, well-being and longevity. A little bit different to some of my other episodes, but I think you guys will find what he has to say fascinating. Tommy, thank you for talking to me today.
Thanks so much for inviting me to be here. I'm really looking forward to talking.
Brilliant. Like I said in the introduction, you're a little bit different to some of our guests who we normally have on the podcast, but I had Dr. Stacey Sims on here earlier this year, and my listeners were really interested in her take on exercise and nutrition. So I wanted to follow it up and get some thoughts from other wellness experts. So that's kind of how I came across you. So can you kind of just introduce yourself to my audience, tell us who you are, what your background is, apart from being a very smart guy, which I've told everyone already.
Sure. So I am an associate professor at the University of Washington in Seattle. My main role there is to run a basic neuroscience lab. So my lab studies ways to either prevent or treat certain or multiple types of brain injury. And we do that with with what we call basic science, animal models. But we also do a lot of work with clinical data in the populations that we do work in: babies with brain injury, concussion, traumatic brain injury in adults, some work with cognitive function and cognitive decline in older adults. So that's kind of the body of my current academic work. Through those various academic experiences you already mentioned, I became very interested in athletic performance, on top of the biochemistry and the medicine and all that kind of stuff. I was a rower as an undergrad, and then at med school, I was head coach of my medical school boat club when I was there. And so I became increasingly interested in, what are the different aspects of physical performance that we can modify, and how does that work in elite athletes, but also how does some of that translate over to the general population. During my PhD, I helped build a company that worked with athletes on all kinds of aspects of their health and performance. We did nutrition, we did blood tests. Actually, if whatever fluid we could get out of you, we would test it for lots of things. And a lot of those individuals were professionals, but others were, weekend warriors who wanted to have longevity in their sport as masters athletes. And then through that, I started work in Formula One, which is where I do most of my athletic performance consulting right now, primarily with Formula One drivers.
And with your Formula One work, are you focusing on the longevity of an athlete or on their performance?
It really depends on the athlete. So I've worked with drivers who have concerns right now about something very short term, issues with sleep, or they have questions about nutrition. I've certainly had drivers who are like, I want to keep driving into my 40s and 50s. So what can we do now to make sure that my eyesight, my cognitive function, my physical function, stays good enough to be able to perform, was essentially the premier racing series, motorsport racing series in the world. And then I've certainly had other drivers, particularly recently, the last couple of years, who've said, well, actually, do you know what? I'm probably going to stop Formula One sometime soon, but I'm already interested in longevity just for me personally, right? And while some of the same ingredients are important for all of those things, each one requires a slightly different sort of approach depending on the individual's background as well as their goals.
So did your interest in longevity come from your interest in neuroscience or the other way around?
That's a good question. Most of those things kind of came in two parallel tracks. I think that the neuroscience side, at least initially, now at least in my head, it makes sense why all of these different pieces come together. But initially, the neuroscience was kind of separate. But when I was working with athletes, particularly because many of them were interested in their long-term health as well as their long-term performance, that was probably where my interest in longevity started. But what's interesting is that then that information translates over to the work that I do in the lab, because there are a number of scenarios where, I mean, it could be a brain injury, but it could also be some of the things that lead to brain injury. So one of the conditions we study is preterm births, babies who are born before the normal end of pregnancy. And when those babies grow up to be adults, they seem to suffer some of the diseases of aging earlier. So, all these bits come together where, even some of the things that we study in the lab are relevant to longevity as well.
Yeah. And in terms of the neuroscience side, you've got a podcast as well, don't you, called Better Brain Fitness?
Yes.
And the tagline there is how to keep your brain fit and healthy so we can do the things we love for as long as possible. So I wanted to start there and talk to you and ask you some questions about aging. And I've heard you say something which I think might prick up our listeners' ears. I heard you say that I believe age-related cognitive decline and dementia are largely preventable. Now, yes. we are an aging population. Mm-hmm. And I believe in recent years, dementia and Alzheimer's disease are the leading cause of death, maybe. I mean, I saw that in 2022, they accounted for 11.4% of the total deaths worldwide, which, puts into context how big that is. Mm-hmm. But can you just start by explaining to our listeners the difference between dementia and Alzheimer's?
Yeah. So I'll even start a little bit earlier than that, which is that if we think about dementia as a disease broadly, and I will give the different the breakdown of dementia afterwards, but right now the burden of dementia in high resource countries like the US and the UK is expected to triple over the next 2 to 3 decades. In the UK already, I think it's the number one leading cause of death. In the US, it's like number 6. But is expected to be number 2, and then potentially even number 1 over the same decades. So
why is it so behind in the US? Why in the US is it 6 and we're 1?
It seems to be the other things that are more more common causes of death are certainly more prevalent, and at least they haven't been addressed in the same way. So number 1 has historically been, as it was in the UK, heart disease. And that is still the same case in the US. And then cancer is another big one. And those tend to be related to the overall health of the population because heart disease, as well as numerous cancers, are related to metabolic health and body composition and all those other kinds of things, as well as, overall access to healthcare, which is less well distributed in the US than it is in the UK. So I think a confluence of those things is probably driving some of those differences. And some of it might also be how you count what you died of, because in reality, many people have lots of those same things at the same. You have heart disease and you have dementia or cognitive decline, and often people die with cancer, even if they don't die of cancer. So some of it can also be in the accounting. So regardless of how you look at it, dementia burden on the population is expected to increase dramatically over the next few decades. And that's largely driven by an aging population. We like to sort of upfront talk about like doom and gloom, like dementia is just like ever increasing and there's nothing we can do about it. But it's interesting that, and most of this data comes from the UK, but it's been replicated in the US and in Europe as well. At a specific age, right? So at 65 years old or at 70 years old, you are now actually slightly less likely to get dementia than you were 2 or 3 years ago at that age. And that's thought to be because of a population focus on heart disease. And when you target heart disease, actually, you're targeting some of the risk factors for dementia as well. So at a given age, you're less likely to get dementia now. But because you're going to live longer, overall, you're still more likely to get dementia, if that makes sense. So it's kind of like a complex set of moving parts. Now, to finally answer the question that you asked, let's start with defining dementia, which is essentially the end stages of a period of cognitive decline, such that you get to the point where you essentially are unable to look after yourself on a day-to-day basis. You've lost a significant chunk of cognitive functions, such that other people have to help care for you. And that's kind of like the threshold that we call dementia. And it's formally diagnosed by how you perform on certain cognitive function tests, and you would hopefully, ideally, you rule out some other causes like depression can sometimes look a little bit like dementia, and certain nutrient deficiencies can drive or be associated with dementia. So, assuming that there isn't some easily identifiable acute cause, that gets you a diagnosis of dementia. But there is, before then, some period of years, if not decades, of cognitive decline before you get to that point. The stage before dementia is called MCI, or mild cognitive impairment. And then even before then, you may lose some function before you get into MCI. So it's kind of like this decades-long trajectory downwards, rather than you just like suddenly one day you have dementia. Now, there are multiple different kinds of dementia, and they're kind of classified based on what you see under a slice of brain on a microscope after the person has died. So some of the classification is a bit artificial, which is a nice way to put it. But there are things like dementia with Lewy bodies, frontotemporal dementia. There's a dementia that seems to come with Parkinson's disease. But the two most common ones, which also overlap a lot, are vascular dementia. So that's kind of related to the heart disease stuff I was talking about. Essentially, the blood vessels in the brain become diseased, and they essentially clot off, and you start to lose blood flow to different parts of the brain, and then you lose the associated functions of those parts of the brain slowly over time. And then what we call Alzheimer's disease, which is about 60 to 70% of cases of dementia, although there is a big overlap between vascular dementia and Alzheimer's disease. And I think in many ways they're sort of on the spectrum of a similar, if not the same, disease process. And Alzheimer's disease, until a couple of decades ago, we used to just call age-related dementia. And what we call Alzheimer's disease now, that late onset Alzheimer's disease, because there's also early onset Alzheimer's disease, which is what Alzheimer originally described, but now we kind of lump them together. That is essentially the end part of cognitive decline that comes with aging, and is essentially related to a number of health-related, environmental, and other lifestyle factors, as well as genetic factors that kind of increase the susceptibility or trajectory of cognitive decline as we get older.
So when we look at longevity, I kind of sometimes consider we're trying to beat the system, and we're trying to live as long as possible. So the natural aging system is going to happen. So going back to your quote, where you say that you believe that cognitive decline and dementia are largely preventable, how?
So on the face of it, you could think that a statement like that is quite controversial. But in reality, even the dustiest, most evidence-based forms of academic medicine will now say that is true. The best example of that is the Lancet Commission, which is run by Professor Gil Livingston, who's a worldwide Alzheimer's expert. She's based in the UK. But there's a whole world group of experts that came together to look at all these different risk factors for dementia and identify the ones that are modifiable, and then estimate, if we did manage to completely eradicate those risk factors, what proportion of dementia would we expect to prevent. Right now, they just updated their Livingston or Lancet report this year, and they estimated 45% of dementia is preventable. And that's based on things like early education, reversing things like hearing loss and vision loss, improving body composition. They talk about obesity, but of course, like muscle mass and all those things play a big role as well. Then smoking, alcohol, head trauma, all these different things come together, and they suggest that something like 45% of dementia is preventable. However,
that's massive.
Yeah, it is massive. And right, I said most, which with a conservative definition means more than 50%, which is obviously more than the 45% that they said. However, they didn't include other things that we know are protective. They felt the evidence wasn't quite good enough, though I think if you apply the same kind of parameters that they did, I would tend to disagree. But so on the cusp are things like sleep. They didn't include sleep deprivation or chronic sleep issues as a risk factor, which I think we can say probably is. They also didn't include specific nutritional status, and we know that there are a number of different nutrients that if you're insufficient or deficient, you have an increased risk of dementia. And then they also didn't include something like late life cognitive activity, which we also know is very protective. So I think if you stack those on top of it, I think we would definitely get above 50%. And there are other estimates like Professor Yin-Tai Yu, who's a professor in Singapore and did an analysis using data from the UK Biobank. Their analyses suggested that maybe even 70% or more of dementia is preventable. So I think, even if we apply really rigorous scientific guardrails to how we estimate these things, I think it's safe to say that the majority of dementia is preventable.
And did that Lancet study include exercise? Because a couple of studies I've seen you mention that there's randomized controlled trials that show that resistance training improves the structure and function of various parts of the brain, and also that the more muscle mass we have, there's a lower risk of cognitive decline. So were those studies included in this giant study?
Yeah, so I think one of the risk factors as they stated it was by being sedentary. So obviously the opposite then being true, that increasing physical activity should be protective. So yes.
So what's your thoughts on resistance training?
Whenever we think about exercise and how it affects health, we generally focus on aerobic exercise, going for a jog, walking, cycling, all those things, which are great. What's interesting is that different types of exercise seem to affect different parts of the brain. So if anybody imagines a human brain, and it's essentially this kind of wrinkly, grayish pink mass of tissue. On the outside, what we call the cortex, that's sort of our quote unquote gray matter. And then there's also gray matter inside the brain, but it's sort of that's the main part of it on the outside. And on the outside and down near your ears is, say, an area of the brain called the hippocampus, which is very important for memory, and is affected, particularly in the late stages of Alzheimer's disease. The gray matter responds really well to aerobic exercise. And it seems that we know that if you have people who are sedentary and then you put them on even just a brisk walking program for a year, you start to see improvements in the structure and size of the hippocampus. And there are some other studies showing that if you do very high intensity exercise, you also see significant improvements in the function of the hippocampus if you do specific cognitive function tests that test that part of the brain. When it comes to resistance training, that seems to particularly benefit what we call the white matter, which is the part in between. So if you were to slice open a brain, the middle bit of it is much denser and whiter because it has a lot more fat in it. There are these things called myelin sheaths that wrap around the axons of neurons, which help improve the speed and fidelity of conduction of the electrical signals in neurons. And this part of the brain, the white matter, which actually, if you compare to other species, one of the things that's quite or relatively unique about the human brain is how much white matter it has. This seems to particularly respond to resistance training. So, like you said, we recently published a paper that sort of summarized all the studies where they'd done a resistance training protocol, and then they'd also done images of the brain. And you can see that in those who do some kind of resistance training, you see improvements in the structure and potentially function of this white matter part of the brain. And even though we don't talk about it a lot, the loss of white matter as we get older actually follows very closely with the trajectory of cognitive decline and then dementia. So we know that white matter is really critical, and it seems that resistance training in particular seems to improve the structure and function of that part of the brain.
Okay, so you're kind of making assumptions that if we do the resistance training and we improve the white matter of the brain, that it's not going to decline at such a rate as we get older.
So there are a few ways to, some of it we have to kind of say, yes, this looks like that's going to happen. There are studies where I think we can be confident that at least some of that is true, right? Nobody, sadly, is doing lifting studies and then showing that prevents dementia, because that could be a 20-year study, and those things are very hard to do. Although there is a very big or large scale study of resistance training and a whole bunch of stuff related to brain structure and function over several years that they're doing in Denmark called the LISA study. So hopefully we will get some more information on that soon. But say there's one of the best known studies in this arena is called the SMART trial, where they took individuals in their 70s, and in two of the groups they had them do some kind of resistance training. It was 3 times a week. You go to the gym, 6 exercises, 3 sets of 8 to 12 reps, just like the super standard basic resistance training. You can use machines, like something that anybody could do, literally. And they saw improvements in structure of the white matter of the brain and significant improvements in cognitive function that came along with that. So even though I can't say lifting weights prevents dementia, all signs kind of point that you're moving the brain in the opposite direction from one that might be heading towards dementia, if that makes sense.
And so what's your thoughts on the dosing of resistance training? Because that was something quite interesting that came out of my chat with Dr. Stacey Sims. Now, obviously, she researches females. So her tagline was that all of those studies you've talked about are done on sedentary men.
Not true.
Go on.
So actually, the one of the best known studies in that arena is called the Brain Power Study, which is done exclusively in postmenopausal women. And what they found was that there does seem to be a dose response effect. And so the minimum effective dose is to see significant changes in brain structure and brain function was 2 sessions per week for at least 6 months. And I will say that when it comes to resistance training and how it affects brain structure and function, there's no evidence to suggest that either the dose or the response is different in men versus women.
And so we're talking here about how resistance training affects our white matter in our brain. Mm-hmm. But I imagine you also believe that resistance training is important for building lean muscle mass in terms of aging. So is the dosing protocols different for those 2 factors?
So probably only that actually the dose required to start to see improvements in lean mass and strength is probably less than the dose required to see benefits to the brain. So if you are doing enough to benefit your brain, you are almost certainly doing enough to then improve lean mass in terms of strength and size. So 2 sessions a week. And again, a very simple protocol that would maybe take you 30 to 45 minutes. At that point, you're almost certainly doing both at the same time.
So you believe that the government guidelines, basically, so in the UK, obviously the government guidelines does recommend twice a week. I think, like you said, 10 body parts, 6 to 8 reps, not very heavy. You believe that the research does support that is sufficient.
So, absolutely. So what's interesting is that other studies have looked at exercise more broadly. And when they look at the minimum effective dose of physical activity to create a change in cognitive function that's meaningful, right? Because sometimes you can see a significant improvement on a cognitive function test, but like the individual wouldn't notice a difference. And so there's like a clinically meaningful difference. The minimum effective dose of exercise overall is about the same as government guidelines. So like everybody complains that government guidelines aren't enough, but actually if we did them, we would see significant improvements. And so that relates to resistance training, but also to exercise more broadly. I will say, you kind of said that like not too heavy. That's a nuanced thing, right? Because one thing that we know about resistance training, particularly when it comes to muscle mass, and probably also how it relates to other things like brain function, is that the number of repetitions you do doesn't matter that much. But what does matter is that you should approach what we call momentary like muscular failure, right? Where you can't do another good rep with good form, right? So if you have a heavier weight and you do 8 to 12 reps and you couldn't do a 13th rep, then you're in a good spot. It probably could be a little bit heavier and you do a few 5 or 6 reps, or it could be a little bit lighter and you do 15 or 20 reps. It particularly when it comes to muscle mass, that doesn't seem to matter too much, but it does need to be difficult enough. Whereas as you get towards the end of your set, you probably couldn't do a bunch more reps. And particularly when people haven't lifted weights before, they tend to underestimate how much they can do. And that's fine. You get better at it over time and you learn to kind of push yourself a little bit. So then the next important thing to mention is if you look at what happens to people who've never done much exercise before and they start an exercise program, other than walking, lifting weights in this kind of like bodybuilding style, weightlifting style is the safest in terms of exercise, in terms of like injury risk. So if you had never done any exercise before and you started running instead, your risk of getting injured is probably 3 to 20 times higher running than it is lifting weights. So people are often worried about injury risk with lifting weights, but actually, if you do it kind of how it's prescribed in this way and done in these studies, it's very, very safe.
Yeah, I agree. As a physio, I'm obviously giving people strengthening exercises very frequently, and it fills some people with fear.
Yeah.
And again, one of my taglines is it's got to be heavier, but that doesn't mean you have to go and lift, a heavy barbell.
Yeah.
I think exactly what you said, it has to challenge you that last rep, you can't do anymore. And that's quite an easy rule to remember, really, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. So it doesn't need to be heavy. It just needs to be heavy for you, if that makes sense, right? And what it is for you personally is all that matters. And the absolute weight matters much less.
So let's move on to cognitive stimulus. Mm-hmm. So again, I've heard you talk about the importance of lack of cognitive stimulus being positively associated with deterioration in brain health. Yeah. So if someone wants to kind of help themselves in the aging process, what do you mean by that?
Yeah, that's a good question. When I talk about this, and I've written papers on this with my colleague, Dr. Josh Turknett, who is the other host on the podcast, often we actually frame it in terms of exercise as well, because it's something that people can understand a bit better, right? I think it sounds like your listeners are going to be familiar with the ideas of why exercise is important and how it challenges our tissues, and in response, be it the muscles of the heart or the muscles of your biceps, after they're challenged, and you give them an appropriate period of recovery and nutrition and all that kind of stuff, then they come back stronger or bigger. Or both. And essentially the brain is exactly the same. And we can think about that in terms of how the brain initially develops, but also in terms of the rate of how cognitive function declines or not as we get older. And what it seems like is the function of your brain, just like the function of your biceps and the function of most of the tissues in your body, and we could think about your immune system, we could think about your liver, most tissues, their function is directly proportional to the stimulus we apply to them, right? Which is a fancy way of saying, right, if you want to get bigger biceps, you do more bicep curls. And if you want to get a bigger, more jacked brain, then you need to do the brain's equivalent of bicep curls, which is usually learning some kind of complex skill or complex information. So in terms of what that might look like, it could be music, learning how to play an instrument. It could be languages. It could be complex motor skill, something we call open skill sports. So a sport or an activity that requires you to react to the environment. Like cycling and running, a closed skill that sort of you get your head down and you just kind of move in one direction. But badminton or table tennis or surfing, require you to constantly adapt and move and respond to the environment. And that seems to be provide a greater benefit to the brain above and beyond like the physical benefit of performing that kind of activity. So, another thing that seems to be really beneficial and in most studies has like the biggest effect size for improvements in cognitive function and brain structure and mental health potentially as well is dancing. And that's probably because it has a complex movement component, it has a music component, it has a social component, and all of these things kind of come together to improve cognitive function. So the simple answer to your question is you learn complex skills because that's like bicep curls for your brain. And then how you do that, there's actually lots of different ways to skin that cat depending on your interests and what you have available to you.
And can someone start to learn those complex skills in later life to help the deterioration? Or have you got to start it when you're young?
No, it's actually never too late to start. There are some of the studies on dancing, looking at how dancing affects brain structure, are done again in individuals in their 60s and 70s. And I think one of the most important take-home messages when I talk about these ideas is that this idea that society has kind of baked into us is that as we get older, our brains just decline, and there's literally nothing we can do about it except make it worse, like have too many beers or not sleep properly or get stressed. Actually, the brain retains the ability to respond to the environment, to learn new skills. The fancy word is it maintains neuroplasticity even late into life. And probably the only time when it's actually lost is once you have significant dementia. So there are studies lots of studies in older adults showing that they can learn new skills just fine and it improves cognitive function. They can improve fitness just fine. And that also then decreases their risk of dementia. So it's absolutely never too late. And your brain retains an incredible capacity to improve, even very late into life.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Because, if you think about an older person and you try and encourage them to take up a new language, I can't imagine the uptake is going to be so massive. But I wonder if some of that's from motivation as well.
So, some of it's from motivation. And there's an interesting idea that's come across from work from people like Ellen Langer, who's a psychologist at Harvard, where she talks about stereotype embodiment theory. And what it essentially shows is that as we get older, we start to embody the stereotypes that we have of older people. And then our function and health follows after that. So if we think that old people become frail and demented, or they start to lose their marbles, lose their cognitive function, we embody that stereotype, and then we start to stop doing the activities that would prevent that from happening, right? So if you're like, well, I'm going to get older and then I can never learn new things, I'm too old, right? So you stop learning new things, and it's the not learning new things that drives the cognitive function rather than because we got old. So a large part of it is driven by our expectations of what will happen. And then those become self-fulfilling prophecies because we stop doing the things that will prevent that from happening. It's like saying, and you'll hear this all the time with athletes, and I've said it myself, right? I was a rower when I was in university. I'm like, I will never row as fast on a rowing machine as I did back then. So I'm just not going to do it anymore because I hate to think that I'm not as good as I was back then. But it's the not doing it that's the problem, rather than the fact that I'm a little bit slower than I used to be, right? And how we use our brains and interact with the environment is exactly the same.
So on this podcast, we talk a lot about mindset and resilience. So I was going to ask you actually your thoughts on how our mindset does actually affect our physical brain health.
Yeah, and that's one example, but essentially a huge part of how our physical and cognitive function changes over time is driven by our expectations and then the mindset we have to engage in the different processes that would prevent that. I think my favorite researcher in this whole field remains Ellen Langer, because she's done a huge number of studies that show that how you think about something directly affects your physiology and your health. So the first example, I could give several, but the first example, which kind of feeds directly into this, was a study that she did with Judith Rodin in nursing homes in the early 70s. And what they did is they split nursing home residents into two groups. It was sort of randomized into two groups. And one group, they basically said, you have complete control over everything you do. I know you're in a nursing home, but you can do whatever you want, go wherever you want, interact with whoever you want. You have control over everything. And we give you this plant, and it's your responsibility to look after this plant, which is kind of cute. The other group, they said, you're in a nursing home, you don't have to do anything. All of the responsibilities about your care and life have been handed over to somebody else. Somebody else is in control, and that person will also water this plant for you. Over the next 2 years, essentially, the people who were given or retained control were more active, were more healthier, and were less likely to die than the other group who gave over control, right? They continue to be engaged in the activities related to, that will support their long-term health. When you then think about other things that later came from Ellen Langer's work, she did things like the chambermaid study is one of her most famous studies, where they had chambermaids, as they call them, were essentially cleaners in hotels. And because of the nature of and busyness of their work, they didn't have time to do exercise outside of work. Some of them had some health issues, blood pressure issues, blood sugar issues. Some of them were overweight. And what they did is they randomized these chambermaids into two groups. And one group, they just sort of like followed along. And the other group, they said, you do know that when you're pushing vacuum cleaners and flipping beds and changing sheets and climbing up and down stairs, right? That's exercise, right? You're doing a ton. You don't need to do exercise outside of work because you're doing a ton of exercise. And then that group saw significant improvements in their health, and didn't change anything else because they also tried to account for that. So just by appreciating the fact that they're doing this thing that's beneficial for their health, they saw improvements in their health. And then there's other studies they took people into a lab, and a lot of Ellen Langer's work is to do with manipulating how we perceive time and how that then affects our health. And so what they did is they had people, and they had them sleep either for 5 hours or for 8 hours in a lab. But then they changed the clock to make it look like they slept either 5 hours or 8 hours. So some people slept 5 hours and knew they slept 5 hours, but some people slept 5 hours and thought they slept 8 hours, and vice versa. Some people slept 8 hours but thought they slept 5 hours. The people who saw the biggest decreases in cognitive function, like alertness and reaction time the next day, are the people who thought they slept a short period of time, regardless of how long they actually slept. So if you slept 8 hours, but you think you slept 5 hours, you're like, I didn't sleep well. I'm not going to perform well today. And then they didn't. So I use that study as an example of like when we're using poor quality wearable data to tell us how we should feel the next day, we will feel bad regardless of whether those data are correct or not, because it's telling you that, you're under recovered today. You got to take it easy. You didn't sleep well. that may or may not be true because actually the data isn't very good.
Yeah. So our mindset is actually
Yeah.
changing our physiology, which is unbelievable.
Absolutely.
But
Yeah.
what I'm going to take from that chambermaid story is that I'm just going to tell everyone I don't need to go to the gym anymore because I've got 3 kids and a really hard job.
Yeah. I mean, up to a point, that's absolutely right. Because the alternative is you're like, oh, I've got 3 kids and a job and I can't do exercise, but I know I should exercise. And because I'm not exercising, I'm not attending to my health the way that I should, and I'm gonna be less healthy because of it. And it wasn't an Ellen Langer study, but there is a study that looked at that using data from NHANES, which is a big, like, nationally representative population data set in the US. What they did is one of the questions they asked people was how much do you think you exercise compared to other people like you? And what they found was that the people who thought that they were very active and did a lot of exercise compared to other people like them, they lived longer regardless of how much exercise they actually did, right? They adjusted. So, like, you have 2 people do exactly the same amount of exercise. All the other health related factors, heart disease, income, education, all that kind of stuff is the same. If one person thinks they're more active and the other one thinks they're less active, the person who thinks they're more active on average lives longer. So,
that's amazing.
Yeah, up to a point, that's really important.
Yeah, I mean, I could talk to you all day about the mindset stuff. I'm so interested in it, but I've got so much more I want to ask you.
All right, sorry, you just wound me up and let me go. Yeah.
No, I find it so interesting. I want to go to nutrition because, well, there's quite a lot of focus at the moment on the gut microbiome.
Mm-hmm.
What's your thoughts on the gut microbiome and its effect on brain health?
I think that it's probably important, but right now we don't know enough about it to worry about it. I've written papers about the gut microbiome. I've spent years poring over gut microbiome tests in people, and it absolutely plays a role. But we don't understand it well enough to try and manipulate the gut microbiome directly to then try and have effects on our health. Because we also know that the peripheral health affects the gut and vice versa. So all the things that we know improve cognitive function and overall physical health, they also benefit the gut, but we don't have to think about, like, individually manipulating it, like with different probiotics or other things. Like, physical activity, exercise, generally, there's some, like, niche stuff that happens at very high exercise volumes. But generally, physical activity, great for the gut microbiome, right? But trying to figure out exactly what's happening is really, really difficult. Improving sleep, improving stress, overall improving the quality of your diet. All those things beneficially impact the gut microbiome. But to try and say that the gut microbiome is the exact reason why it's happening, or to measure what's going on in the gut and say, this is the mechanism by which that's happening, right now we just don't have the level of detail and knowledge to be able to do that.
So at the moment, regarding nutrition, are your thoughts just healthy, balanced diet, basically?
So yes, but, like, what does that even mean? So I focus on a few things as much as possible. And of course, there's a huge amount of nuance to this, but as much as possible, you're focusing on minimally processed foods as a whole. Because once we get into extreme food processing, and that could be processing fats, processing carbohydrates, we start to uncouple the nutrition content in terms of macronutrients and micronutrients from the physiological responses. And we get, like, much bigger blood sugar swings for the same number of calories, which can then plays a small role. People have become hyper focused on just blood sugar, but we start to see what the body expects to happen for a given number of calories or macronutrients. The processing can negatively affect that. So as much as possible, focusing on minimally processed foods in terms of, like, what you have access to. And then making sure that you're getting enough protein and high quality protein. I think that should be a big focus.
Do you have an amount of protein that you recommend?
Yeah, so I think the minimum target should be 1.2 grams per kilo of body weight per day. If I think the ideal is probably closer to 1.5. If you
So
are
it's
very
a lot
physically,
higher than a normal person gets, I think.
yes, absolutely. Which is why, in general, I would focus on the protein first, and then the other stuff afterwards, just because it's hard. It's hard to achieve it otherwise. But that's where you start to see significant improvements in body composition, strength, potentially some other health-related factors as well. And some people are recommending much more than that, 2+ grams per kilo of body weight. I don't think most people need that unless you're in a significant caloric deficit or you're a very, very high activity level. I think 1.5 to 1.6, something like that, is probably fine for most people. But that is about double the RDA.
Yeah, exactly.
And then beyond that, I think that you can tailor this. I would base it on some objective health metrics. I would measure your blood lipids, like your cholesterol. I'd measure blood sugar, and blood sugar regulation, HbA1c, fasting blood sugar. I would measure nutrient status for some critical nutrients related to brain function. So you can measure B vitamin levels. Homocysteine is a marker of B vitamin requirement that we know is really critical as a risk factor if it's elevated, and homocysteine goes up if you're missing some B vitamins, and that is a risk factor for dementia and heart disease and a few other things. Vitamin D, iron levels, all really important. So I tend to just focus overall on a pattern of quality as much as possible, making sure you get enough protein, and then the rest, omega-3 status is also important. Right, you can have some general guidelines, but what somebody needs based on all those things is going to be different. So if somebody has very poor blood sugar control, they're pre-diabetic or diabetic, I'd probably recommend restricting carbohydrate intake. But other people don't need to do that. So that's kind of how I would navigate that.
So how would you recommend someone goes about measuring that? Would you advise them to get I've gone blank. What it's
CGM,
called.
a continuous glucose monitor? No.
Yes.
In general, I would not recommend that people get CGMs because they don't need them. You can get a fasting blood sugar test and an HbA1c test from your GP, and that's like bread and butter for them. So they should do it if you ask for it. If they don't, there are a number of different companies where you can just get them either an at-home test or you go to a lab and get them done. In the UK, in the UK, I do some work. I'm head of research for a database side of a charity called Food for the Brain, which is a dementia prevention charity. They have an at-home blood test called the Drift test, and it's dried blood spots. So you basically it's kind of like when you test your blood sugar if you're going to test it like if you have diabetes or something. But you basically just do a little prick on a finger, and then you just drop some blood onto this filter paper, and that tests homocysteine, HbA1c, vitamin D, omega-3 status.
Okay.
So it's not everything, but it's easy to do. You can do it at home. Disclaimer: I work for the charity that makes this test, but most of the basics you can either get that way, or you should be able to get through your GP.
Yeah, because basically we're all different, aren't we? So some of us might be deficient in one thing that someone else won't be deficient in. Exactly. So that sounds to me like a very sensible option. Test your blood, see what you need, and then go take it. Because I think these days, especially with social media, there are so many mixed messages out there. And people see, oh, you need to be taking this, and you need to be taking creatine, protein, omega-3, then the list goes on. And I find it very, very, very difficult. And I'm less kind of like a knowledgeable science person, and I don't know what to do for myself. So what about those people that don't have any interest in science? I mean, I think it's a real minefield out there at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. Which is why I think I have some very basic nutrition rules that I kind of gave you, like get this much protein, as much as possible, get your food from whole foods. But beyond that, what you need is going to be very different. But we do know, right, this is the level that your blood sugar should be. This is the level your omega-3 should be. This is the level your vitamin D should be. That's, dozens, if not hundreds of papers and meta-analyses and all those kinds of things have said, like, this is the cutoff where we know risk is increased. So if you're below that for vitamin D, take a vitamin D supplement. But not everybody's going to need that. So that, I think, gives you the best balance of, here's like a sensible framework that most people can work with. But beyond that, some basic testing, which is thankfully getting easier and easier for people to get, is going to help guide you whether you need to take supplements or anything like that.
Yeah. Thanks, Tommy. I've got written here in bold, don't ask Tommy about his thoughts on alcohol. But I'm kind of tempted really quickly.
Wait. First, you have to tell me and the listeners why you wrote that note in the first place.
Because I'm scared to hear the answer. Not that I'm a heavy drinker, but I do enjoy the odd glass of wine here and there. Do we think that is detrimental to our brain health going forward?
No.
Oh, yay. Excellent.
So I can qualify that a little bit. So again, right now in the longevity sphere, there's been this big push against all alcohol entirely, and just like any drop that you have is going to be toxic and bad for you. I do understand why some people take that approach. I'm not like recommending that anybody goes out and does, and drinks. But if you sort of look at the entirety of the data that exists, what I think it shows is that something like up to 1 drink per day on average, there's no net effect on your health at all. Historically, we thought that small, moderate amounts of drinking were beneficial. It's probably that there's a little bit of healthy user bias, right? That the people who are complete abstainers and the people who drink a lot, there are other things going on that kind of drive some of that relationship. And then the people who are able to just like occasionally have a drink, they're also the people that eat more salads and go to the gym and don't smoke and that kind of stuff. But I think we can kind of say, so there was a nice study that looked at brain structure. We talked about gray matter and white matter earlier. Brain structure, again, in a large UK population in the UK Biobank. And what they saw was that at sort of up to 1 to 2 drinks a day on average, there wasn't really any effect. But then after that, it started to decrease. So, and I think that's kind of consistent across lots of different health outcomes. Like some alcohol maybe slightly decreases your risk of heart disease because it thins the blood slightly, for want of a better way of phrasing it. But small amounts of alcohol might slightly increase your risk of certain cancers or strokes. So it kind of like evens out, essentially. So what I tend to say is that 1 or 2 drinks once or twice a week is probably fine. Above that, you might start to see some negative effects.
Dr. Stacey told me I can eat more carbs, and you've told me I can drink a glass of wine. So I'm only going to get doctors on the podcast that tell me these things, and then I'm winning.
I mean, technically that's true. And I would also agree that especially historically, having worked with a lot of, I've done a lot of work in the low carb arena. I think it's very powerful for certain conditions, particularly helping you manage diabetes, maybe some other conditions as well. Ketogenic diets can be very powerful for a number of different brain things. It looks like certain mental health conditions, bipolar disorder, stuff like that. But that doesn't mean that it's right for everybody. And certainly there are lots of people who benefit from more carbs. So I do agree with that. And yeah, you can. So now you're gonna more carbs, more glass of wine, and then just sit there and think, I did quite a lot of exercise because I'm busy with kids. There you go.
Brilliant. And I'll learn a language as well. I'll sit still and learn a language.
Great.
Thank you so much, Tommy. There's so much more I could have asked you, but I wanted to keep it as succinct as possible for people to understand, what you're saying. I think what you say makes just loads of sense. Where can people find you if they want to know more?
The easiest place to find me in terms of social media is on Instagram, at Dr. Tommy Wood. There are clips of talks and podcasts and all that kind of stuff goes on there. The podcast, wherever you get podcasts, the Better Brain Fitness podcast with myself and Josh Turknett. That is it's a question and answer podcast. So almost all our episodes are just responding to listener questions. So if anything I said today didn't make sense, or you vehemently disagree with, which is perfectly possible, please submit a question, and then other people can benefit from the answer as well. And you'll get all the details if you just find that podcast. And then the final part of that is Josh and I also have a Substack, where if you sign up, and it's free to sign up, the first thing you get is a PDF in your email, which lists all the different blood tests that I talked about earlier and the nutrients that are important for brain health and the foods that you will find them in. So again, if you got confused when I was talking about all those different blood tests, you just get that. You can get that free PDF when you sign up for the Substack. There is a paid version of the Substack, which means that you get to come to like monthly Ask Us Anything questions. So if you're like really interested, you can do that, but obviously not necessary, or not essential at least.
Thank you so much. So interesting. Thanks for taking the time to talk to us. It was a little bit of a different chat to normal, but full of nuggets of wisdom. And I think people can make really positive changes off the back of this chat. So that's what my podcast is all about. So thanks so much.
Glad. That's certainly my hope. And thanks so much for having me. I really, really enjoyed it.
Brilliant. Thanks. I really hope you enjoyed today's episode with Dr. Tommy Wood. I found what he said really fascinating. I think there's so many nuggets of wisdom in there, and it is definitely going to change what I do going forward regarding my brain health. So I hope you found it as interesting. Please let me know your thoughts as usual, and don't forget to follow the podcast wherever you listen to it. And also you can catch us and subscribe on YouTube.